everybody, Paul Mack here. I've got another viewer question. This one comes from a fella named Will. He asked, how did the old timers know how much fertilizer or manure to add to their kitchen gardens? Granny always said you couldn't put too much cow manure on a garden, that it would not burn the plants like chicken manure can if you add too much. Thanks. Well, Will, most of the larger livestock manure, when applied fresh to a garden, are not helpful. It's not typically a good thing to do. One time I had, as you may know, one section of my garden I let rest each year, and then that rotates around. And while that section is resting, during the winter, I try to put on piles of cow manure, which is fresh because I'm not going to be growing anything for at least another year or more. And then on top of that, I might put any carbon material I find around the farm, whether it's leaves from the woods, spent hay, old hay that's kind of been wasted and rotted and not good for feed anymore. I'll put that on top of the manure, and then I'll just forget about it for over a year and just let that cook into the soil and break down. So I don't put fresh manure where I'm going to be growing plants immediately. There was one year, though, that I had my resting area going. I had put manure on it through the winter, put leaves on top of it, and the manure was kind of spotty. There wasn't a lot of it. There was just a pile here, there, and yonder. And come following spring, when it got going, I had some other, I think there were tomato plants that somebody had given me. And I ran out of room, and I thought, well, I'll just stick them over here in this resting area. You know, it's not like I'm growing a big crop there. I'll just stick them in there, you know, part the leaves, plant them in some of the dirt. Hopefully they won't hit any of the manure, and I'll have a few extra tomatoes. Well, lo and behold, the leaves, as they grew that season, curled up, and it's just weird looking. It didn't even look like tomato plants, and obviously they didn't grow anything, so they didn't do well at all, and basically they were burned by the cow manure beneath. So it's not a good idea. I won't ever be trying that again. It's also not a good idea to have fresh manure during your current growing season near your plants, because pathogens in the manure haven't had time to break down and be rendered harmless yet. So just a good idea to not apply fresh manure to the garden unless it's perhaps rabbit manure. I'll talk to you about that in just a second. Now, let's back up. If you ask the common person on the street, who's maybe a gardener, maybe not a gardener, is livestock manure good for the garden? The answer will typically be yes. And they are correct. It is. But those same people, sometimes if you delve further into what they think they know, you'll ask them, do the plants actually eat the livestock manure? And they probably will say, yes, they do. That's where things are misperceived. It's not that the plants are eating fresh manure. They don't do that. In fact, it'll burn them for the most part. It's that worms and other microorganisms that are in the soil. Of course, the worms are the most obvious. The microorganisms you generally can't see with the naked eye. I call it the little kingdom. And it's a wonderful little kingdom. And they are responsible really for a very healthy soil. Sort of like, lime is the king of beasts. The worms are the king of that little kingdom. You know, a thermometer, like if you're sick and your mama sticks a thermometer in your mouth to figure out how high your temperature is, you know, that thermometer is not helping you. It's not healing you. It's just showing a symptom of what's wrong with you. But worms are kind of different. Worms are a thermometer that actually does heal you, so to speak. In other words, worms are a great indicator that your soil is either doing good or it's not doing so good. In fact, the very presence of worms in your garden means you're doing something right. And the absence of worms at all times of the year is an indication that, whoa, something's going wrong. So not only are they a litmus test for if your soil is doing well, but the plants are basically, here's what's happening. Plants are not eating fresh livestock manure. The livestock manure, as it sits on a space, decomposes, much due to what the worms and the rest of the little folks in the little kingdom, the microorganisms, are doing, breaking down that manure. They're digesting it, and their excrement is basically, for the most part, what the plants can then digest. And so worms are not only a thermometer of, is everything going well, an indicator, if you will, but worms are actually doing something for your garden. So basically worms are the great, I call them the great equalizer. Whatever's wrong with whatever deficiency your soil may have, whether it's acidic pH or an alkaline pH, the worms are going to fix that. Given enough time and enough food to digest, i.e. Animal manures and other carbon materials, leaves, old hay or whatever, grass clippings, the worms are going to fix your problems. So, if you got worms and they're doing well, after a given amount of time, your garden's going to be doing well. Now, livestock manure is not so much technically a fertilizer as it is an amendment to the soil. But then, of course, the worms and other microorganisms break it down, eat it, consume it, and render it in such a way where over time the plants can consume it and your ground is more fertile, which I guess livestock manure is a fertilizer. Potato. It's kind of confusing, isn't it? Now, as I said, the worms and the other microorganisms, they're taking the fresh manure and over time they're breaking it down and rendering it more palatable to the plants, making your soil more fertile. But this takes time. It takes time to see the benefits. Don't think that you're going to go grab some fresh livestock manure, throw it on your garden, and within a week your plants are going to be beautiful and luscious. And this takes time. It takes time to improve an infertile soil and bring it to fertility. And see, this is why it's not really, I guess, too favorable to a lot of people, because we live in a society that's, I've got to have it now, instant fast food, photos done in 1 hour, 5 chairs, no waiting, TV dinner society, and everybody wants things instantly. So that's why you've got to be patient with livestock manure and adding it as an amendment to your garden before you see the benefits that you're looking for. Now, most fresh livestock manure needs to be aged before you add it to the garden. Either that, or you can, like I do, you add it to the garden, but you don't use that section for a long enough period of time to allow it to break down. The one exception to adding fresh manure to the garden would be rabbits. You can generally add that. I don't know that I would put it right up against the plants. If you're going to add that to your growing plants, you need to kind of side dress it at some distance, maybe at the outer edge of those leaves, if you're going to use rabbit manure. But it is the one manure that generally won't burn the plants. Now, you can add manure to a ground that you're going to be planting, whether it's a field crop or whether it's a garden section. If it's composted aged manure, we call that barnyard. If it's composted manure, what you want to do is harrow the ground or basically scratch it up. You can use a harrow type implement or a disc lightly, scratch it up, apply the manure, the composted manure, and then scratch it again. And then you should be good to go just about immediately, since it is composted manure. But let me say that fresh manure can be applied to acreage, to a field crop area that you're going to plant or to a garden area. And if you're going to apply the fresh manure, for instance, in a manure spreader or just by hand with your, throw your kids and your wife in the back of the truck, drive around the field and let them shovel it out and spread it as good as they can, you're going to want to do that further out, away, or earlier, much earlier, like at least 6 months earlier than you're going to plant. And that fresh manure, you're going to want to spread it and then plow under the area. Rather than scratching it with a harrow or disc, you're going to want to plow that fresh manure and get it into the soil. And you want to get it turned under the soil so that the good part doesn't just leach away from the top, but get it in the soil where it's going to be so that the soil will hold it there. In a diagram in one of my books, it shows that the earlier you do that, you actually have more produce. You produce more results the earlier away from planting time that you get that in the ground and get it plowed under. However, you can age fresh manure right on the garden where it's going to be on your field or wherever. You just want to delay that planting and give that manure time enough to break down and decompose. As I said, in my garden, I have one section that rests a whole year, and that's where fresh manure is applied in piles. And it's at least more than 12 months before that is even broken up to be put the planter to it. Now, if you're applying that fresh manure to the garden, I generally don't like to spread it if it's just going to be sitting there on a resting area, because I don't till it or plow it in. I just let the piles rest in a pile, a heaped up pile. Sometimes they're probably 16, 18, 14 inches high, and I will put leaves or old hay on top of that to kind of keeps it from leaching or eroding too terribly bad, and just let it cook. I have the feeling that there's less leaching that's going to occur when it's heaped up like that, especially in the center. I mean, there might be some leaching around the top, but in the center you're going to keep most of the good stuff and just let it sit there and cook with the microorganisms and the worms eating it from the bottom. One of the downsides to using manure for gaining fertility in your garden or your fields is generally on a small homestead or small farm, there's not enough manure being produced to fertilize the whole area at once, which is why I just concentrate on one section a year. I can handle that. I've got enough manure from my livestock to handle one section, and then those sections are rotated, and that ends up over a period of time your garden's just going to get more and more fertile. Now, some crops, some things you grow do not appreciate as much nitrogen as other crops, and that nitrogen is what that area that I have resting, that I've got the manure piled up on. After that's finished cooking and is composted and turned to barnyard, that area is going to be very rich in nitrogen. And there's some crops that don't care for that heavy nitrogen. For instance, your legumes, your beans and your peas are not going to, they could care less about nitrogen. Corn, sorghum, other things, perhaps tomatoes, okra, are going to appreciate the nitrogen. So those are the things that if you're in a rotation like mine, immediately after that resting period when your nitrogen levels are high, those are the things, for instance, probably first start with corn. Those are the things you're going to want to grow first in that section as it rotates along. And then right before, the time comes around to rest that section again, the last thing you would want to plant there would be your beans and your peas, because by then the nitrogen a lot of the plants have pulled out that nitrogen, the corn, the potatoes, and so forth, and those beans and peas, they're fine with it. They don't mind it. And then after the beans and peas have grown, you start that resting period again. It all cycles over again. One thing you want to be careful of, if you're using fresh manure in your garden and on a section that's resting and it's not too far away from other plants that you're going to be digesting rather quickly, for instance, greens, turnip greens, leafy greens like lettuce or whatever, you want to wash those vegetables really, really well so that no pathogens. There's nothing to worry about. I mean, don't go losing sleep over it. Just pretend you're a coon and wash your food really, really good. Now, I use a lot of manure to bring my garden to fertility, and most of it is cow manure. And I have heard of some folks running into problems these days. Wouldn't you know it? You get something good going and up comes a new problem. So many herbicides. So many herbicides are being used now on pasture grass because everybody wants this luscious, beautiful monoculture grass growing in their cow pasture. And they cut hay from that, and the hay is beautiful and lush. But it looks like a lot of those herbicides are staying in the hay. The cows eat it, and whether it has an effect on them or not, it comes out in their manure. And I have heard say that people are putting manure that's been from cows that are eating that type of hay very, very heavily. It's been heavily sprayed every year, and they have seen negative results in their garden. They now see that their garden won't produce plants because there's too much of that herbicide in the soil. the herbicide thinks the plant is a weed and it's killing it. So be careful where you're getting your hay, particularly if you're using the manure from those animals that are eating that hay on your garden, because you don't want to build up residual herbicides in your garden over a period of time. And if you're concerned about that, one thing you might do is take your manure in the summertime when your livestock are generally eating grass and not eating so much hay in the wintertime, and that perhaps could help you avoid that. But just know that problem is out there. Unfortunately, we've got another thing we got to deal with. Or you can use mostly chicken or rabbit manure, which hopefully your rabbits aren't eating a whole lot of hay that has herbicide sprayed on them. If you have a question about what we've talked about today, or another question about anything related to the farm, just leave it in the comment section below. I enjoy reading those, and if it is a good question that I think a lot of people will benefit from, we'll use it on a later edition of the Q&A show. For now, I'm Paul Mack, and I'll talk at you later. B. Hamby 9305, you should run for president. Is there enough garden space on the White House lawn? Oh, they probably got it zoned against chickens. Washington and Jefferson would be appalled.